When it comes to video games, there are certain characters that are just more well known and influential than others. A lot of the time, this is because of when they were created, their influence on gaming, or maybe there's just something about them that's iconic. They're characters that everybody knows, even people that don't claim to play video games. Prime example would be Mario from the Mario Bros. Series. Mario is the face of video games as a whole, something that I think most people would find hard to dispute.
There's probably not a single person who doesn't know Mario. He's that famous.
Something really interesting about Mario, though, is that despite being so iconic, he's worn a ton of hats, both figuratively and literally. He's been in adventure games, platformers, turn-based RPGs, strategy RPGs, hell, he's even been Paper. But despite all that, one thing has always remained the same. He's always been Mario. Except maybe in Paper Jam, where it was established that Paper Mario is from an alternate universe. A lot of video game icons tend to shift between genres like this while still bearing some sort of familiarity to their roots. After all, human beings, especially gamers, are the types that clamor for change, but not something too drastic to betray what it originally was. So even though every Link is technically a different incarnation each time, he'll always get a sword and shield, and he'll always save someone because that's what defines him and that's who he is. Mario will always have a red cap, and will always do some sort of jump-related things to win. You wanna know a video game icon that I feel has had the most drastic changes between his iterations over the years? Megaman. Megaman is another character that everybody knows, even if they don't know all the fine details. He's defined by being blue, having an arm cannon, and having one-on-one boss fights with other men. Yet despite being so iconic, there's been tons of different versions of Mega Man. OG Mega Man, Future Mega Man, Norton Antivirus Mega Man, Alien Ranger Season Mega Man that nobody really seems to talk about, Mega Not a Man, and the one we're talking about today, Shonen Anime Mega Man. It's a game that a lot of people hold dear, and one that a lot of people also have bad memories related to, but maybe not for the reason you'd think. I won't be going into heavy spoilers without warning though, so don't worry. This is Mega Man Legends. Or if you were like me as a kid, Mega Man 64. Mega Man Legends is a video game for the PlayStation released in 1997 in Japan and then 1998 in the rest of the world. The game follows an iteration of the iconic video game character, Mega Man, but instead of being a side-scrolling platformer where you meticulously fight your way through 8 robot masters, Legends was instead an action-adventure game set in a 3D environment. Also, Mega Man was not a robot created by Dr. Light, but was instead a teenager who had been found as a baby in some ancient ruin. A quick anecdote before we get going, this was actually one of the only Mega Man games I had played as a kid. I was a Sega Genesis kid when I was little, so I didn't get to play any of the Mega Man games on the Nintendo or the Super Nintendo at that age, and then we transitioned over to the Nintendo during the next console era, and I never touched a PlayStation, so that meant that I missed out on some of the games during that time as well, and for some reason I just never picked up the handheld ones. Other than that, my only exposure to Mega Man at that age was this game and the Ruby Spears cartoon.
Missed me again, number one, son. But I won't miss this time. Oh no! He's gonna blast President Lincoln! Ha! I knew you'd risk yourself for Mr. Lincoln.
The game was ported to the Nintendo 64 along with some other Capcom titles like Resident Evil 2. Appropriately, it was renamed Mega Man 64, just like most other games that were made for that system. The story of Mega Man Legends takes place in a world that is predominantly made up of water, or as the narrator at the beginning of the game describes it,
in a world covered by endless water, people are forced to eke out a living on the small patches of land that remain above the sea.
Hot dog! It's the late 90s now, so our video games have voice acting. It's a new frontier. Yee-haw! Anyway, as it turns out, this world is full of mysterious ruins that all house killer robots that are also full of money and treasure. So one of the more profitable yet dangerous professions is treasure hunting, taken on by people called diggers. Our story follows a young digger named Megaman. He's accompanied by Roll, another series main character with several different versions of herself, who is sometimes his sister, but other times his love interest. So that's not weird.
You mean we can use this car? Well, come on then. Let's get it attached right away.
Megaman and Roll work together as a digger and spotter team to explore ruins and track down treasure. The game actually opens up during the middle of one of their digs, where Megaman snatches a valuable refractor crystal in a zany Indiana Jones style action sequence, after which you tutorialize your way through the dungeon, fight a boss, and then hop back on your airship for a clean getaway. Shortly after, Megaman and Roll lament that they didn't find the Mother Lode, which is supposed to be some sort of ultimate treasure, or any signs of Roll's parents, who are missing, apparently.
If only the Mother Lode were as easy to find as this.
Don't worry, we'll find it someday. And your parents, too.
And I hope you remember that, because after this, they're not going to mention it again for like 6 hours. Disaster strikes as the ship breaks down, and they make an emergency landing on a nearby landmass called Catalox Island. Megaman and the others set out to fix their airship so that they can leave the island, but end up getting caught up in a conflict brought on by a pirate family called the Bonds. After saving the city and the mayor, Megaman gets tasked with tracking down Catalox's legendary treasure before the Bonds can, and help unravel the secrets that the island holds. Mega Man Legends is a 3D action-adventure game that breaks your typical Mega Man norms in a lot of ways, whereas the original games were action platformers that revolved around picking stages set to the themes of specific bosses, where you'd then blast your way to the end before having a one-on-one duel with them. Mega Man Legends takes more inspiration from games like The Legend of Zelda. The core gameplay revolves around running around Catalox Island, fighting enemies that get in your way, and slowly unlocking new areas to explore in order to advance the plot. Typically, the way the game will advance is that Roll or someone else will make a suggestion or just say, "Hey Mega Man, you should go to City Hall," or something. And then you'll head over there, have some more dialogue, fight some robots, and possibly a boss, and then you'll get a cutscene telling you where to go next, which will then result in either you exploring one of the many dungeons scattered throughout the island, or getting a repeat of the earlier sequence. Lather, rinse, and repeat until you beat the game. Mega Man comes equipped with his handy Mega Buster, an arm cannon that he uses to dispatch enemies, and also has a variety of other handy doodads and gadgets that assist him on his journey. You can buy items from a junk shop to increase your max health, decrease the damage you take, and even fill up the energy tank to use as an emergency healing item, just like in the original series. Something neat about Mega Man Legends was the level of customization and upgrades you had Mega Man work towards throughout the game to give sort of a sense of progression, a real noticeable sign that you were slowly getting stronger and stronger as your adventure went on. Mega Man can attach various upgrades to his Buster to increase its stats, whether it be how long he can fire it, its range, firing speed, or its power. The catch is that at the beginning of the game, you can only equip 2 parts, so while you probably won't have a ton of upgrades to choose from right away, eventually you're going to need to weigh what you want to use because it means sacrificing points in other stats. Though, personally, I always just fell into energy, range, and power because rapid seemed a little bit redundant. The good news though is that you're not restricted to just your Buster. In true Mega Man fashion, you'll get access to a ton of other unique weapons that have their own properties, but unlike the other games, you have to put a lot more work into them in order for them to be useful, or to even obtain them for that matter. You see, in addition to being your pillar of support and maybe love interest, Roll also creates new special weapons for Mega Man based on items that he finds around the island. And just like the Buster, they can also be upgraded, albeit with cold, hard cash instead of random parts. Because Roll's favorite color might be red, but she's still a capitalist at heart, baby. The special items come in a variety of flavors, like a long-range, slow-firing cannon, or a drill, or a grenade, or a super powerful laser that requires you to first get to the end of the game, do a long series of side quests, and then it can be upgraded to kill the final boss in literally 7 seconds if you spend 2 hours upgrading it because it's so damn expensive. Special weapons were cool, and they were a neat incentive to exploring more of the island outside of the story-related dungeons. It was also sort of encouraged to find one that you really liked and just sort of stick with it for most of the game, since you could only have one equipped at a time and upgrading some of them took a lot of money. That being said, there was also a point of the game where it kind of felt pointless to use them anymore. By the end of the game, your main buster will probably have such great upgrades and be so powerful that you'll hardly ever be using your special weapons anymore, except in very niche scenarios. Even better, the buster never runs out of ammo, unlike most of the special weapons, and can also be fired on the move, whereas the special weapons can't. Throw all that together when fighting some of the tougher, faster enemies at the end of the game, and almost didn't feel worth it to use any special weapons unless I just wanted a self-imposed challenge. Sad truth is that Megaman controls a bit like a tank, which makes sense when you consider he's covered head to toe in armor. Being in the PS1 and 64 era, we also were unfortunately cursed with some pretty clunky 3D controls and controllers that made movement a little difficult and awkward at times. Turning the camera around was a bit of a chore, and due to the way damage works in this game, that being that you don't get your mercy invincibility until you actually hit the ground, thus making it possible to be juggled between enemies like a pinball, it was easy to get broadsided by something off screen. Most of the damage I took during this previous run were from cheap shots from enemies I didn't see coming. The point I'm trying to make here is that more mobility and firing on the move was infinitely better to me than standing still and using your special weapons in most scenarios. Further helping this is how Mega Man has the ability to strafe left and right. It's very easy to run circles around an opponent given the room is wide enough, and by the end of the game, pretty much every strategy against the tougher opponents devolved into running in a circle, jumping, and shooting lemons. There, I made it this far into the video before making a low-key Mega Man Ego Raptor joke. Are you proud of me? The actual gameplay of Mega Man Legends was a little stiff, but part of that can be blamed on when it was made and how 3D gaming was still coming into its own. Honestly, it wasn't that bad, it just took some getting used to, and by the end of the game, it hardly bothered me at all. The beginning of the game was a bit of a slog, though. The change in gameplay wasn't the only notable thing about this game when it came to the Mega Man formula, though. There was also its general presentation and story. I'm gonna reiterate that I was never big into the main series of Mega Man games, but regardless, I don't think, at least up until the release of Legends, that Mega Man was ever a super narrative-focused kind of game. For the most part, they were very arcadey, and the plot was always the same. Wily was an evil scientist that was trying to take over the world or something and would build an octuplet of evil robots to do it. Then Mega Man would come in, beat them up, and call it a day until the next game. Megaman X was more of the same, albeit with a different setting and supporting cast, although X did start to develop its narrative a little bit more than the original games. The plots weren't exactly page-turners, but then again, they didn't need to be. Mega Man knew what it was, and it knew what people wanted it to be, which is why I think it's interesting that they decided to eschew the normal Mega Man format and then go in a completely different direction with how a Mega Man game played and how its story was told. The main crux of Legends' plot deals with Mega Man racing against the Bond family pirates trying to find Catalox's legendary treasure. All things considered, this is a pretty low-stakes game when you take that at face value. I mean, it's treasure, right? It's just something that's worth money. Who cares if it's some goofy pirate family that ends up getting it? I mean, it'd be cool to pull the rug out from under them and use that money for some good stuff, but if they get away with it at the end, who really cares? But the thing is that you get several hints throughout the game that there is something far more foreboding and sinister about this legendary treasure nonsense. There's the fact that nobody really knows why there's all these ruins that you can explore on the island, or why they're full of killer robots, or where those robots came from in the first place. They also mention early on that the robots have started to get especially homicidal since Mega Man and Company's arrival. The way the game handles that, in contrast with the loud and bombastic pirate family, helps assist the subtle foreshadowing. While you're focused fighting the Bonds and laughing at their wacky interactions with each other and Mega Man, the game is using that time to set up a bombshell in the background that's going to drop on you later in the plot, which it absolutely does, and which I will get to later when we're talking about spoilers. It was surprisingly easy to get invested in the story of Mega Man Legends because the mystery of the island and the Reaverbots was subtle and sparse enough throughout the game to keep me interested and made me want to keep playing just to see where it was going. But the other thing that kept me invested were the characters themselves. I grew pretty attached to the cast of Mega Man Legends over the course of the game, and believe it or not, I actually think a big part of that was the game's voice acting. I made a joke about it before, but Mega Man Legends came out during that awkward era of video games where it was now possible to insert full-fledged voice acting into a game that was of decent sound quality, but not every game had experienced voice actors or voice directors to compensate for it. The early days of video game voice acting and dubbing were pretty rough as a result. Most actors that were brought in had started on other types of acting work and didn't have much voice acting experience, nor did they receive great direction. It's a far cry from how it is now, where voice actors are pretty much micro celebrities in the video game community, and a lot of video games have what would be considered Hollywood tier acting and direction. And none of this is to say that actors or directors didn't care about their projects, because that's just not true. But voice acting and dubbing still wasn't where it needed to be yet. I feel that Mega Man Legends did a good job with its voice acting though, at least considering when it was made. I know that some people that have actually played the game before will disagree with me on this. It's very easy to look at this game and complain about how dated the voiceover is, but when you consider what the environment of video game voice acting was during that time and how it was still developing, I feel that Mega Man Legends held its own, and I felt that the voice actors did a good job in portraying the roles they were given. Roll has an energetic and supportive voice which fits her perfectly, given that it's her job to support Mega Man.
But somehow, I know you'll always make it back. I have faith in you.
Tron's got that stereotypical tsundere thing going on.
You know what happened to us thanks to you? I thought I was going to die! Huh?
And even Mega Man has a pretty solid teenage protagonist voiceover, which is helped that he was actually voiced by a teenage boy in the first game. I think my favorite character though was Teaselbon, due to how hammy he was, interspersed with moments of clarity that shows that he's not a total screwball and is actually kind of intelligent.
Hey, look at the clock! It's almost time for my favorite show! I almost missed it! Be careful and don't be fooled by his size. He's already beaten Bon and Tron. Let's do it! Don't worry your pretty little head over it, Tron. We tried our best, but sometimes your best isn't good enough. We lost fair and square. That's life.
All things considered, the voice actors did a good job with their characters, and I also appreciate how the characters were written. Characters had visible development and they were very likable. This is all great, especially when you consider Mega Man's earlier attempt at voice acting.
Ah! No, this isn't happening! There's no reason for me to go on. What? What am I fighting for?
That's not to say the voice acting is perfect, because it's absolutely not. There's definitely some odd choices with the dub in particular that made me tilt my head. Like how the Bonds are now called the Bonds, and not just the Bones, like they were in the Japanese version. You know, because it's a reference to how they're pirates, like with the skull and crossbones, which is also reflected in their family symbol as a skull, or how Bone is a real surname, so there's no reason to change it just because you think it sounds silly. There's also the fact of how Mega Man is called Mega Man. I know what you're thinking. Why would they change his name to something else when everyone knows him as Mega Man? I mean, come on, it's the name of the series. Well, it's because in the backstory of this series, Mega Man was found as a baby by Roll's grandfather and raised as his own son, and they decided to name him Mega Man rather than give him a normal name like Fred. Where's my Fred Mega Man, Capcom? In Japan, Mega Man is known as Rock Man, with this game even being called Rock Dash. The joke is that when you put the two main characters together, you get Rock and Roll. Get it? But when the series was brought over to the West, Rockman obviously didn't sound cool enough to sell to the kids, so they renamed him Mega Man to be totally radical. And also gave him some really bizarre box art. And yes, Rockman would still sound silly in this particular setting, which is why in the Japanese version, he's just referred to as Rock. So really, when I think about it, the real reason this was changed may be because international law states that only one man alive is allowed to bear the title of Rock. There's also some moments where the voice acting was put into NPC conversations and it always felt weird and stiff, partly because most of the NPCs outside of cutscenes didn't have voice acting. So it was weird when all of a sudden a random person who you didn't think was important started spouting off audible dialogue. All things considered, I actually really appreciate that this game had voice acting. It might just be me, but characters that have an actual voice make me care a little bit more about them than I would have if they were silent. This is not to say that it's impossible to care about characters without voice acting, because again, that's not true. But if a character does have voice acting, and it's good, I feel it dramatically enhances that character's performance and our opinions on them. The writing of a character is still the most important aspect of how we perceive them, but if you throw in a good voice acting performance along with it, then you've got a character that really seems to come to life and one that audiences like to watch. Overall, Mega Man Legends put a lot more focus in its narrative than previous Mega Man games, and as such, it had to go the extra mile with how it presented its story and characters. Again, I know the voice acting and directing in this game came from a different era, but I feel that it still holds up even today. Anyway, that's all I really have to say about this game, so thanks for coming. Nah, of course I'm not done. It's a pretty big disservice to even talk about this series without mentioning what ended up happening to it. Of course, part of what I'm about to say goes into major spoiler territory, and I'm only going to talk about spoilers briefly, but still, this is your only warning. Check the time code if you want to hear about the development bits. So true to form, you eventually do find out what the legendary treasure of Cadillacs Island is, and as you probably would have suspected at this point, it's not something that will make you filthy rich, but is instead the keys to the apocalypse. Mega Man gets to the bottom of the main gate, a previously sealed up dungeon on the island, and discovers another robot man like himself named Megaman Juno. Juno very calmly tells Mega Man that if he was woken up, then that means it's time for him to do his job of wiping out the carbons on the island. In other words, all the normal humans like Roll and her grandfather. Obviously, Mega Man has a problem with this and sets out to stop him, ending with the two having a showdown and Juno getting destroyed. A quick sidetrack and going back to the voice acting topic, Juno was my favorite performance in this game. There was something really effective about this really quiet, polite, sociopathic villain calmly telling Mega Man that he's about to commit genocide and talking about it like he's just vacuuming his house.
To Urban Military Security Ordinance A10, the number of carbon units is not allowed to increase beyond the pre-specified limit. If this happens, they are to be purged immediately.
Juno is only in the game for about 30 minutes, but he was easily the most memorable character for me. Anyway, after Mega Man beats Juno and is unable to stop the Doomsday Clock, Data, that monkey character that saves your game and otherwise has had absolutely no bearing on the plot, steps in and rambles off a bunch of bureaucratic nonsense to save the island. Data then tells Mega Man that they have all of Mega Man's lost memories, but they can't tell them more about them yet. So they leave, they get a happy send-off from the Islanders, and then the credits roll. This plot then gets picked up in full force in Mega Man Legends 2, where much more about Mega Man's past is revealed, the story takes on a much more serious tone, and overall was much more intriguing regarding the game's world. It also infamously ends on a huge cliffhanger with Mega Man stuck in space, and Roll and Tron trying to find a way to get him back. It seemed as if the third game was going to be hard to wait for because of this, but regardless, fans waited. And waited. And waited. For 10 years. For the longest time, it really seemed like Mega Man Legends was never gonna get a resolution. Every year, fans of the game would beg Capcom to make the third game and release some sort of news about it. But every year, they were met with silence. The creator of the series, Keiji Inafune, expressed a desire to finish the series, but it didn't seem like anything was gonna happen. That was until the year 2010 rolled around, and Capcom made an amazing announcement. Mega Man Legends 3 was finally happening, baby. It was going to be released on the Nintendo 3DS, and you were finally going to get your resolution to the story. There'd be a new character to play as, updated graphics, people were stoked. Their prayers were answered. And then, as you'd expect, these hopes and dreams were dashed over the course of a year. The period of 2010 to 2011 was extremely rough for Mega Man and Mega Man fans. For starters, Keiji Inafune left Capcom late into 2010, and this was unsettling for a lot of people because as the creator and lead director of Mega Man and Mega Man Legends, people were a little apprehensive about what was going to happen to the project. But Capcom stepped in and said like, no, guys, it's okay. Mega Man Legends 3 is totally gonna happen, don't worry. Flash forward 4 months later, and the game Mega Man Universe, which was basically going to be the Mega Man equivalent to Mario Maker, but for Mega Man, was cancelled, with Capcom citing the reasons being various circumstances. And considering that Mega Man Universe was intended to be a celebration of the franchise after not having much relevance in the past few years, this was not a good sign for fans of Legends or Mega Man as a whole. But regardless, Capcom stepped in and said, no, guys, for real, it's happening. Mega Man Legends 3, it's gonna get made. It's gonna happen, don't worry. Then at some point during the interim, Capcom announced a prototype version of the game that would be released onto the 3DS eShop. The game would feature 10 missions and would feature the new protagonist, Barrett. The prototype was intended to be a prologue for the third game, but most people just viewed it as Capcom trying to get people to pay for a demo of the game, which was not well received. It was really starting to look like that Mega Man in general was in a downward death spiral at this point, with bad news after bad news coming from Capcom. But with no official announcement of Mega Man Legends 3's cancellation, fans still clung on to a little bit of hope. But then, it happened. On July 18th, 2011, the thing that the fans were dreading came to pass. Mega Man Legends 3 was officially cancelled. The prototype version was never released, and while Keiji Inafune had left Capcom, he offered to come back and finish the game for them, but he was refused. It appeared that Mega Man Legends was officially dead and buried. Needless to say, fan outcry to this was enormous, which was especially amusing when Capcom Europe cited that lack of fan interest was the reason for the game's cancellation. Despite the game being considered a cult classic, the Legends fanbase made their voices heard loud and proud at Capcom. A Facebook group titled 100,000 Strong for bringing back Mega Man Legends 3 was also created, and eventually met its goals within a year, gaining a significant amount of attention from online gaming sites. Capcom's mistreatment of the Mega Man brand in Legends 3 also played a large part in the successful crowdsourcing of Keiji Inafune's spiritual successor to Mega Man, Mighty No. 9. Tons of people were backing this game, not only because they wanted more Mega Man from its creator, but because some believed it was a way of giving the middle finger to Capcom after how they'd been treating the series. Of course, that enthusiasm deflated quickly as the game was delayed time and time again, and the funds from the Kickstarter seemed to be misappropriated, and the actual final product was seen as extremely mediocre.
Kill an enemy, and you can absorb their power-ups. Stuff that'll make you faster and stronger, and make the bad guys cry like an anime fan on prom night.
All in all, Mega Man and anything related to it seemed to be dead in the water. At least that was the case until recently, when suddenly the series is starting to see a revival. There's a new Western CGI cartoon on Cartoon Network that nobody actually seems to know about because it wasn't really advertised, and Capcom released Mega Man 11 recently, which returns to the roots of the franchise and has been received warmly. So nowadays, it's starting to look like Mega Man is making a comeback, and with how Inafune said that he still has an interest in finishing Legends, maybe the series isn't dead in the water after all. In the end, Mega Man Legends is a solid game and one with a pretty dedicated fan base. There's been one or two fan projects started to try finishing the game without Capcom's influence, but it hasn't really gone anywhere and probably won't due to legal reasons. I do hope the series gets finished someday so we can get closure, because I do want to see how the story ends. It's a series that deserves a proper ending in my opinion, and it'll be disappointing if this never truly gets resolved. I want more of Mega Man Legends, and clearly a lot of other people do too. So here's hoping that someday that comes to pass, and we can finally get to bring the Blue Bomber home.